Welcome to the Real Estate Baller Show. As an investor, some of us prefer to stick to a particular asset class throughout our careers, while others love to explore various opportunities. And that is my friend, Apurva. His journey began with investing in the single-family properties. Frustrated with the slow growth, Apurva searched for new challenges in office spaces and retail properties. And now he has taken on storage buildings. Join us at Apurva candidly share his journey from the frustration to the successes in these diverse investment assets. Hey, only once in a while that I got a guest on the show that got prettier hair than me. So,
Please.
welcome Apurva to the show. Apurva, can you give our audience a quick introduction?
Yeah, nice to meet you. Great to see you, V, again. My name is Apurva, so I'm a local Houston real estate investor for sure, but I run, a lending business, residential and investment lending business called Matador Lending. I've been doing that for a few years, but here today we're definitely talking about real estate investing, which I'm very passionate about, and took a lot of bumps and bruises in my journey, so happy to kind of share that with you.
Yeah, we all about bumps and bruises, right? It
Right.
can't be all rosy like what some of the guru made it out to be on video. So, all
That's
right. So
right.
we first met. You were involved in single family investing,
Yes,
correct?
right.
Tell us
That's
about
correct.
that part of your career.
Yeah. So, I'll start with kind of where I even got exposed to it. So my family, without really having a plan, my parents started kind of real estate investing after they had moved to the U.S., right? As immigrants, they just learned that, acquiring assets was something to do. So when I was a young kid, we would, start to kind of, I got exposed to it. I'd see my parents go and collect rent or deal with the contractor for rehab. And I love them to death, but I definitely know that maybe their approach is not the one that I would take. But I was
They must have
exposed.
had good tenants for you to still want to get in.
Yeah, maybe. um, but their management style was very mom and pop, right?
Yeah, yeah.
They had no destination. They were just acquiring properties, and thankfully, it's done well for them over their lifetime, right? And so they're still seeing the benefit of them in retire of those properties and that strategy in their retirement today. But anyways, that was kind of what got me exposed. So that's kind of all I knew first was single family, and I was listening to all the online podcasts early on and got excited about oh, maybe I should own 100 houses, and that'll become how I retire and things like that. And so early on I started just by like any other person. I bought one rental property, then a second, then a third, then got really kind of motivated to grow. So I'd gotten up to almost 10 at one point. And, when I started buying, I kind of knew that I didn't want to, deal with the property management. So I had hired a great property management team, even at one or two, which doesn't make any financial sense, right? Because there goes pretty much all your profit from a cash flow. But honestly, I wanted to focus on scaling. So that's where that's why I, by design, decided hey, I'll have somebody manage so I can worry about acquiring and building the
Mhm.
portfolio. And I did that for a while. Like I said, I got up to 10 properties at one point.
So your objective when you started out was to accumulate rental, not to flip, not to, wholesale or anything like that.
No, I did fall into some wholesaling kind of just by accident, to be honest with you.
Hmm.
My objective was to build a renter portfolio, that was for sure. Then I had,
Hmm.
had gotten some leads on a couple contracts where I was like, okay, this is there's some meat on the bone here, but I
Hmm.
don't think this is a property I'd want to own in my portfolio for whatever reason, right? And so,
Hmm.
so I kind of by accident wholesaled a couple of houses, right? And said, okay, I just don't want to keep this. I'll move on. Did that, and then I did do some rehabs and some flips, right? So those were kind of
Hmm.
meatier deals where I saw that the rental value or the return on rental probably wouldn't keep up with the upside of just selling the house. And so we ended up, doing a few flips. I probably did about 8 or 9 flips over the course of my career. So over every couple of years, it was like 1 or 2 a year, right? And then now we don't do any flipping at all. Honestly, it's a great business, but it's a lot of work to acquire and identify and then rehab. And then even like you've got market risk of the exit, hey, especially in a very volatile market right now, like, is my end value 8 months later going to be what I thought it was going to be because it's moving that fast, right? And transparently, like now, I think we have a different target for asset class, right? And so obviously we'll lead into that in a second, but like I'd rather just spend my energy focus on acquiring those type of properties now.
So you started out with that objective, want to build a rental portfolio. At what point did you realize this is not really what I want to do? And why?
Yeah, no, so I probably had owned the single families for almost 4 or 5 years, right?
Yeah.
And the paper value or the book value of them had certainly grown. Like exactly to your point, like the appreciation was obvious, right? Part of what was I had bought them off market, so I had bought them at a reasonable entry point, and so some of that value just kind of like caught up to what the market values were of the houses.
So you became
And
a
so
millionaire on paper. So paper millionaire, right?
I'm gonna call it paper thousandaire, but yeah, no. I mean, on paper, it was a healthy growth, right? And
Yeah.
so then it was a question of like, well, hey, how do I translate this into like income now, right? And so I just kind of really took a hard look at like what these properties meant. Also, opportunistically, I felt like, okay, maybe these were the top of the values of these houses. Like, I don't know if it'll go on forever, right? They were suburban houses. I don't know if like, were they ever going to double in value? I didn't see it. Maybe I'm wrong, right? There was markets where that stuff happens, right? But I just didn't feel like that was the case, right? And so some of it was just like a gut call. So I was like, okay, well, how do I kind of continue to grow? But I wanted to really focus on cash flow, right? And so I shifted my focus of an appreciation investor, which is a great strategy for many people. But like for me, I was like, I just really wanted to do cash flow, right? And so I started looking at asset classes, and so really shifting more towards commercial. Then I started analyzing all the different commercials. I had a little bit of exposure because I bought a little bit of commercial property, but really smaller stuff, like sub $500,000 properties, right? And so these are smaller, like single user. We had bought a creative office building or it was a warehouse that we turned into like creative office space, like a co-working space, and that was great business. So we ended up having like, we sold it as membership. We sold like 20-30 memberships, and we had private offices. I'll give you the numbers on that one. For example, we had bought it for like less than $350,000. We ended up getting it to a point where it was doing almost $20,000 a month, right, on a building like that, which was great, right? It
Yeah,
was like
that's
crushing
awesome.
it. Yeah, it was great. And so I was like, oh, this is awesome. But it had simultaneously it had a big operational aspect of it, right? Because it was like a membership, like it was running like a gym, right? Like
Yeah.
you needed a front desk person, you needed like, day-to-day upkeep, you needed like housekeeping daily. It was a very active business, right? And
So just to put things in perspective, this is more like a WeWork kind of thing?
yeah,
Okay.
exactly.
Okay.
It was a WeWork, but we bought the real estate, right? That was the main piece. Like
Yeah.
WeWork kind of rents buildings, right? And then they
Yeah.
sub-rent it, right?
Okay.
We were like, okay, let's just own this real estate. And it did well. So the building ultimately, we ran that for many, many years, very successful, right? From a cash flow standpoint, but it also had a big kind of operational piece that I was like, okay, I don't want to do that. That goes against landlording, right? Like the
Yeah.
whole point is you're not in the day-to-day. And so that building we ended up exiting for north of 650, 670, if I remember correctly. So we did well in that building
Yeah.
too, right?
Yeah.
So it cash flowed, plus we had a good exit, right? So, but then again, so I'd kind of learned a little bit more about commercial, and I said, hey, I like kind of this multi-tenant version of it, but I don't know if I want to like run a co-working business, right? And so I bought a retail building that ended up doing really well. We, ended up buying it and exiting it within a year and a half, and just created a bunch of equity, upside, and then sold that. And then I finally got into self-storage, right? So I ended up selling all the single family. I sold that warehouse. I sold the retail buildings, and all that capital got put into self-storage. Now we currently own 2 and we're under contract to acquire our third, which would represent almost 650 units once we close on the additional portfolio. But we currently run about 550 units today of self-storage. So, our first facility was pretty small, 120 units. And then we bought the second one, which was much bigger, it was like 400 units. So, and then since then we've added some units to the facilities to get it to about 550.
I'm sorry for this interruption. I've been asked a lot about passive investment. And let's be real, there is nothing passive about being a landlord unless you have a really good property management company. So if you own an Airbnb or a short-term rental and you want to get back your time, please give our team at Buzz Vacation Rental a call at 281-549-8432 or go to our website at pm.buzzvacationrentals.com. Now back to the Real Estate Baller Show. So what you attribute to your success, like just dabble into different things. And like I said earlier, I don't think luck has to do with all of it, but you were able to went from single family into office space and then into retail space and exit with profit.
One thing that I learned by great mentors and colleagues in real estate investing, just much like yourself, is that one of the key themes is buying it right? And so you have to understand how to do the math, right? And understand what you're looking at. And then right is subjective, right? Like, if you're emotional about a deal, then buying it right may be more expensive than what the next guy would have paid for it, right? So like nowadays, I take the emotion out of it. I never get excited about a deal. It's just, do the numbers make sense, right? Even though it may be a beautiful building or whatever the case may be, my lens is, it's just materials, right? Like you can repeat it, you can, do it again if you want to, if you find a better piece of land. Like if there was a beautiful building, but it's not affordable, well then fine, just go recreate that yourself, right? If you really want to, right? So buying it right is the key, right? So I think I felt what I believe is a good sense of doing the math of buying a property correctly. And then that gives you shelter for the ups and downs, right? Of the market and like cash flow and things like that, right? So I think when we bought that office, the warehouse creative office, like we paid very low at the time for what we acquired it for, right? And it was in a thriving area. The simple rule of thumb, like, location is everything. So we bought in a great up and coming, it was East Downtown, early when it was, still just getting kind of revitalized. Now it's a very, very premium part of town, right? And so, so we did well with that. So, back to kind of your question is like, hey, what is the strategy? The strategy was like just making sure that we were paying, a low entry point to buy the property. And then, we had a reasonable business plan of how to get it to stabilize, right? And so, the co-working was very experimental, and I take my punches by learning, right? I just kind of like dive in, and I learn by doing, right? As like I just kind of want to figure it out. When I started buying single family, I kind of figured out, okay, what the rehabs look like, what repairs look like, and just kind of the management and maintenance aspect of it was all just based on figuring out how you do it. And then you make mistakes along the way. Those are lessons that you never forget, right? Because those mistakes were usually expensive and stressful and emotional. Now, most of our analysis, once you've underwritten so many deals, like you can kind of look at a deal quickly and have an idea of what you want to pay. It doesn't always work, but we try and target buying properties at land value if we can, or below build cost, right? So for example, in our storage, which we'll fast forward to in a second, we've bought both of the facilities that we've acquired. It's less than what it would cost to build new is what we paid for them. And they came with cash flow already in place. So that, there's a lease up period that, you would have to factor if you had built something new. Usually, in storage, it takes 8 months to 12 months to sometimes even 2 years to start getting occupancy up to north of 70-80% if you can even get there. So that's time that you would have had, like you would have built it, probably takes a year, then another year of stabilization, then you finally see cash flow, right? So we had an edge because we were buying a property that was already stabilized. Maybe it was underperforming, but then we bought it based on less than what it would cost to build new. So that's kind of a simple thesis that we have is like, can I buy it at, if I can get really lucky, I can buy it at dirt value. That doesn't always happen. But if I can buy it for less than build cost, then I feel like I'm doing okay.
Okay. So I've always heard this, that single family has the easiest barrier to entry, right? So you don't even need to have a lot of cash to enter. If you buy it right, you don't need to have any money out of pocket.
That's
But
right.
that's not the same with commercial or storage building. Is that right?
Yeah, so it depends how you're financing it, right? It goes first and foremost, like if you're going to go traditional financing means, yes, you need a lot of capital, right? And especially in a market like right now, 20 to 30% is like the minimum, right? And some banks are pushing 40%, right?
Yeah.
It's because there's a lot of risk in general, but also commercial is heavily weighed on the property, current performance, your business plan, your ability to execute a business plan of stabilization, and what's the cash flow. Like right now, cash flow is everything, right? So there's an adage that in commercial real estate called DSCR, which is debt service coverage ratio, right? So like, what is it going to cost you for your monthly payment, with taxes, insurance, everything? And then how much cash flow above that is this property going to do? So banks are heavily scrutinizing that, right? So they want a significant cash flow above the debt. And so if you can do that, well then great. But that means you bought a really good deal, right? But if it's tight, then they're either going to lower your loan amount, so you're going to have to put more and more down to make it work, or sometimes they just don't want to touch the deal at all, right? Which is even common right now. But yeah, that's what we kind of look for.
So are they still looking for a 1.2 ratio, or is it a different ratio?
It varies by asset, right? But yeah, I mean, 1.2 is a good rule of thumb, just kind of across the board, right? If you've got a multi-unit, like a self-storage, they might be a little bit more. But if you're like a 5-unit shopping center, then they're going to want to see a healthier DSCR, because if you lose one tenant, right, now your debt service coverage and there's is in jeopardy, right? And not to get in the weeds of commercial lending, but there's what's called covenants, which basically is rules by which your loan follows. And so like they'll say like, hey, if you fall below kind of the threshold because you lost a tenant, if you can't get it corrected within a reasonable amount of time, you need to pay down the loan or pay off the loan or refinance, like all kinds of outcomes, right? So those are stuff you got to be careful with when you're out there, getting in the commercial world. But I would argue there's two sides of the coin. Yes, single family, better, lower barrier to entry, right? Like there's a lot more financing tools to buy single family. But once you start acquiring commercial, there's very little scrutiny to your personal finances. They're heavily underwriting the property, right?
Okay.
And over time, once you start getting a track record, and I know that's not easy when where you're starting at zero, but once you start getting a track record, commercial lending becomes much and much easier, because then you've got relationships with your lenders. Then they just know you, and then they know that you performed, and they say, okay, like, what are you trying to work on now? Like, V, you're trying to buy your third property with us. Okay, tell us what the deal is. We know you're a good borrower. It becomes a little bit easier over time.
Okay, so let's talk about your storage unit.
Yeah.
So you obviously bought it at a really good deal. Did you have to do any value add? Hey, if you have any questions or comments, please leave them below.
Yeah, so the first one is a very funny story. So I bought it through COVID, right? So interestingly enough, self-storage in the past decade has become a very hot asset class.
Yes.
So you've got the big boys, like the big, like CubeSmarts and Public Storage. That's like the institutional grade, right? Then you've got this middle layer of like smaller kind of, but they're still like, probably 500 to 1,000 unit type of properties. And then you've got the bottom layer, which is the mom and pop facilities, right? So we dipped our toe with a mom and pop facility, right? So 150 units is a very small, self-storage facility. And so what we started, I just started kind of looking at the asset class as a whole. And there's guys trying to buy every of those layers now. Like there's the big institutional guys, there's people buying that like crazy. There's the people chasing mom and pops, right? Just like in the single family, where like if you have a single family house, you get phone calls all day long to sell your house, right? that's happening to the self-storage guys now, right? Like everybody's trying to buy it, right? So it was very competitive. So I'll tell you the story of how I bought mine though. It was actually sitting on market. And so one of the clues of strategies of finding property on market is you look for a poorly listed property. So this one was actually sitting on LoopNet and it was on market for a long time. So usually for me, that's a clue. And that's how I actually filter for properties. I'll look for stuff sitting on market for a long time. Okay, why is it sitting online? I was like, it's a self-storage, it's a hot asset class. Why is this thing sitting on market for so long? So I started calling on the listing, and nobody would call me back. So literally, that was first problem. I was like, okay, well, there's unfortunately maybe a bad agent sitting on this thing because nobody was even calling me back, right?
Yeah.
So one day I got fed up and I just called the phone like 10 times in a row, and finally somebody answered it. They were like, "What are you
calling me?"
Yes, I was like, why is this person, like, it doesn't make sense. Why is it listed if nobody wants to sell it, right? So the guy calls and he's like, "Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, I just put it up there for my buddy. He's the guy selling it. I just had access to MLS, so I listed it for him, but you should just call him." So now I was direct to seller, which was huge, right? Even though it was on MLS. I called the seller and he instantly picked up the phone and he was like, "Oh yeah, I'd love to show it to you." And I was like, "Okay, great. I'll come out next week." So then I go and check it out, and the property was listed, and I don't know if you want to like unpack cap rates, but it was listed at a very low cap rate, which meant that it was priced very high, right? So it didn't make any sense, right, for the listing. So I was like, "Dude, I don't understand how you're getting this number." You know, he was listed north of $1 million for a property that probably should have been like 700,000-800,000, almost double the price, right? So anyways, long story short, I meet him and he was like, "Oh yeah, I mean, it's a storage facility with 100-something units, and it comes with the house and it comes with these 2 lots. That's why I want it for over $1 million." The listing did not state any of that.
Oh my God. Okay.
So it was really poorly published, right?
So lesson learned: do not use your friend as your listing
Don't
agent.
use your like overnight, like once a year part-time agent friend to list your property. Please don't do that, right? Anyway, so when I put all the pieces together, we came up with a number. The property, in my opinion, with the value of the land and the value of the house, was probably around 900 something. So we ended up buying it roughly around 900 something, right? Of which the house alone was probably worth 200, right? So if I back that out, now I had the storage facility, roughly we were paying 700 and some change for, but it was 120 units of storage, right? So on average, we get about $100 a door. So now it's doing about $10,000 a month on a $700,000 purchase price, right? So now the thing was like, okay, this makes a lot of sense, right?
So I'm assuming you had leverage on it. Yeah.
Yes. So we had a 2-part leverage. So we ended up, again, I had a bank relationship because of my previous commercial deals. So I called that same guy and I said, "Hey, I'm trying to get into storage." He's like, "Oh, we like storage. Tell me more about the deal." I explained to him kind of how it works. The house that came with it, the guy was living in, so there was no cash flow in the house. Of course, we were just going to rent it out. So we just introduced another roughly $2,000 a month that wasn't even happening. So now the cash flow between that and the storage was really strong. So the deal made sense. But the extra icing on the cake is the seller agreed to carry a $175,000 seller note. So
0%? 0%?
I wish. Only you get those kind of deals. I got 6%, which wasn't bad, right? So we ended up getting a 5-year balloon with the seller at 6%. We ended up getting, and he carried, so that a little over 10% of the deal, right? And then we ended up getting the first lien at roughly around 670 or something like that. So we ended up getting very little out of pocket, to be honest with you. So we ended up getting icing out of the cake was, I think we put a little less than 10% in. You have to have a bank that's okay with this. Not every bank's going to be okay with it. But because the cash flow was already there, they're like, okay. And they knew us. They were like, okay, we'll do a 10% deal with you, right? And so the first lien was still low. The bank was happy. We had a second lien, and then we had our cash infusion. But the cash flow, the global cash flow, once you introduced the house, was great, right? Our debt service, even with both liens, was great. And so We ended up closing on that deal. We've since then added, the value add piece was those lots that we had. We ended up doing some gravel to one of the lots and added another 20, 30 units of parking storage. So we put a fence around it, we graveled it, and now we've got another 30 units of parking. Roughly gets about 60 to 70 bucks a month per parking. So it's almost $1,500 a month in new cash flow on just dirt. So it's like, now it's become like almost like a grand slam of a deal, right? Because the storage runs great. It had under market rents, so we kind of optimized and corrected the rent. So we got those up almost 20%. The occupancy is still very strong. We added the cash flow for the house, and we added cash flow for the land.
Wow, that's amazing.
Thank
so,
you.
I was going to ask you next if you would have the ability to develop the land into, whether another single family home or more storage units.
Yeah, so that's a great. So you're like, that's why you're a brilliant real estate investor. So the second lot is exactly that's what we're doing. So we just got some quotes to add some more storage to it, and so we're looking at two options: a pure ground up where we're building actual buildings, but now there's another product called portable storage. So it's like these kind of ready-made boxes.
Yeah.
And so we may just end up doing that because it's a little bit cheaper. There's less architecture, planning, any of that stuff. We don't have to deal with any of that. We just get some boxes and start filling them up.
Are you required with the engineers, the flooding control to have add drainage area?
If we built, yes, there would have
Okay.
been some drainage. So we would have lost some land for that, right?
Yeah, right.
With the portable, you kind of get away with not having to worry about any of that.
That's amazing. That's going to save you by a lot.
Yeah, I mean, right now the math looks really good on it. Plus, what's even icing on the cake is you get better financing terms for the boxes versus having to build.
Okay. So these units, are they air conditioned or not air conditioned? And what's the variation in price?
So our first facility is all non-climate controlled, and so it's a little bit easier of an operational standpoint. Our
Yeah.
second facility is climate controlled or part climate controlled. So of the 400 units, 100 units are climate controlled. Those obviously rent at a higher price point. Transparently, if I had to do it again, I probably wouldn't do any more climate controlled if I had to buy another facility or build another facility. I just don't think the premium you get, which is probably another 40% higher, but then you have, the cooling expense, the HVAC expense, right? So the net is not significantly more, at least in the market that we're in. Whereas the demand for the non-climate, I think when people think about storage, unless they have something like really important, like art or something that they want to store that's kind of, needs the climate control, most of the people is just kind of their like crap that was sitting in their garage, right? And so they don't really care. So they're just looking at price point, right? Like how much can I get a price, like a lowest cost unit for? And so I'd rather just be more competitive on a price and not have the climate. But yeah, I mean, we have it, and that honestly is our lowest vacancy product, or lowest occupancy. It doesn't do well compared to the non-climate.
What's your price per square foot on the average?
So that's a good question.
Like for rent? Yeah.
Yeah, so our 10 by 10s, which are roughly 100 square feet, right? They rent for like, on the low end, $90 a foot, or $90 a month, right? Times 12. Sorry, I'm just doing the math here. So it's roughly $10 a foot on our non-climate 10 by 10. Right.
Yeah.
And then in some of them, our 10 by 20s will go up to like 120, 130 a foot. So you can kind of just follow the math there.
Yeah.
But that's roughly where it is, $8 to $10 a foot.
I was just thinking, like, this is another sidetrack, right? When I first moved back to Houston from Colorado, I had a storage unit. I rented a unit. And now to think about it, after you do all the math, at some point, I wonder if people will catch on and say, you know what? It's cheaper to just throw away all that stuff than keep storing, right? Hopefully
Look,
the public will never catch on.
I was a tenant of a storage facility for 3 years, and without fail, it was one of the big names, right? Every 3 months, they would keep raising rent. I remember
Yeah.
I move in was like $150. By the time I moved out, it was like $350. And I just took the pain over and over again because it would take 3 days for me to deal with it, right? And unload and all that stuff. So I just kept paying it for years, right? And it's also like out of sight, out of mind. I think that if you have a hoarding problem, you should just solve it by selling everything, right? But there's a lot of people that just want to hang on to their stuff and keep it. I will say we have some users of the space that they're more active in the sense that we have like some landscaping guys, right? They store their equipment, they're in and out, they come in and out daily. So they're more active users. Those are people that I think make a ton of sense. The people that just have I think the common misconception is just people that have their crap, right? A lot of our users are active businesses that kind of go in and out, right? There's some fulfillment guys that are storing like their product, that they're e-commerce guys are selling stuff online, right? They need a place to store it, right? So for those guys, I think it makes sense, right? But yes, the common person that's just keeping all their extra stuff it's not a great thing. And I'm go against my own business, but that's the honest truth, right? Let's be real.
Yeah. Okay. So let's sit back here. Here we are, looking at all the investment, different type of investment that you have been involved with. What's your favorite?
When we sold the warehouse, we bought a retail property, and that property we paid roughly $400,000 for. And then our intention was, it was like a prime retail freestanding building, and our intention was to just rent it out. So we put it up for lease. We hired a great broker to do that, and he started getting a bunch of offers. So we got really lucky with a lot of those like auto insurance companies, right? They kind of have those like freestanding buildings, and so it was great. So we had these great offers. We bought the building for like 300 something. We were getting $5,000 a month rent offers. So I was like, oh, this is awesome, right? Like this is going to be a great win
That's
again.
One single tenant, like a single tenant space?
Yep, single tenant space. So we're like, okay, this is great. We're going to go ahead and sign one of these leases. This thing's going to be worth a lot more and all this good stuff, right? And in hindsight, I shouldn't have sold it, but I ended up selling it anyways. But along the way, what happened was one of the guys that was trying to rent it, he had his broker call us and say, hey, would they just sell it to me? And we were like, I don't know if we want to sell it. I think we're just going to keep it. And he was like, look, like I really want the building, name a price. And I was like, well, if you rent it, like let's just do the math, right? Like if you rented it, we'd get probably $60,000 a year in rent. On a simple cap rate, it's probably worth like $700K, $750,000, rented, stabilized. So I was like, give me 700,000. And he was like, dude, I'm not going to give you 700,000, but he ended up giving us, I think it was like 575, right? And this was less than a year.
Yeah.
We hadn't even owned it for a year.
Yeah.
We didn't vacuum it. We didn't do any improvements. It looked exactly like it did when we bought it. So we were like, dude, like we almost doubled our money and didn't even touch it. And so, in fact, so long story short, we agreed on the contract. We ended up selling it. In fact, we had to defer the sale because the guy was ready to close. But if we closed too soon, we would have had short-term capital gains tax. So we had to like tell him to just wait on us. So we had to avoid it, right? So like long story short, that was one of my favorite deals. But back to kind of like, my storage is my favorite property, asset class now. And I don't so I think there's guys that do a lot of different type of real estate successfully, right? They have like a lot of different types of like assets, and I think for me, I want to just focus on one and get really good at running that type of real estate, right? And so we've just narrowed our focus on storage, right? And so like we have crazy ambitious goals to get $100 million portfolio of storage, right? And that's a goal, right? So for us to get there, I think we have to be laser focused on just getting really good at storage, identifying deals. We need an acquisition strategy at a very aggressive pace. And so I think if I distract myself with short-term rental, and I distract myself with, buying multifamily or whatever the other asset classes, which I'm never going to be good at if I do too many things, I'd rather just get really good at one and just really get depth of the portfolio. So that's kind of what our strategy is now.
So if you had to give an advice to a new investor who looking to get into real estate today, what would it be?
So find a good mentor first to start with. somebody that's, a reputable mentor. Nothing against like these guys that sell courses and things like that, but there are good people out there at many of the real estate meetups that are seasoned, that know what they're doing, that are happy to kind of, give some mind share. Usually, like, the way to add value to somebody like that is like, hey, let me be your deal guy. Let me go find opportunity. Let me knock on doors for you, because you probably don't have the capacity to do that. And that's a good two-way street, right? I had a young guy that messaged me randomly on Twitter, specifically for that. He was trying to get into storage. He said, hey, like, I'll go like be a bird dog, and I'll go find, I'll call all these guys, and when I get somebody on the hook, can you help me analyze and like help me participate? And I was like, absolutely. And he did that. He literally got in touch with people, and we had conversations. And, so I think that's a great way to give value two ways. If I was new, I would start with that. And then underwrite like crazy. So there's like, nowadays we're all lucky because there's millions of YouTube videos and like content online that's free, that you can learn how to underwrite any asset class, right? And I think the mistake I made was, had I focused on, one specific asset class, a decade ago, I'd be way further along in the portfolio, right? But, you can't change history. So I'm like, okay, now I just try and not distract myself, right? And that's just for me. Like, for me, I think like laser focused on one specific asset class and just get really good at that, I think is going to serve me better in the long run, right? So my advice would be like, hey, get like underwrite a lot, right? And you can do all that online for free. You can literally go on MLS and decide, hey, is this a good deal? Is it going to rent for good or not, or whatever? And should I buy it at this price or whatever? And you can do all that for free, right? But most people won't spend the time, because it's, like it's going nowhere, right? You're like, oh, I'm like downloading, I'm filling in spreadsheets, I'm not making offers, but you're just learning. You're learning all the nuances along the way. And then, like I said, once you get to underwriting 20, 50, 100 deals, you get really good at kind of understanding recognizing what a deal is and what isn't. And then even if you don't have your own capital, if you can recognize a good deal, then you can call V and she'll partner with you with her money anytime you need, right? So
what, either one of us, right? Either one of us, if we see a good deal, we want to jump on. Yeah.
Absolutely. You'll find good capital partners, right? And especially somebody in the industry that wants to like support your project, then they also have, good wisdom and good resources to help, right? Like, if I had a problem with like a roof guy or whatever, like I know V has good trustworthy vendors. She'd be a good ally for me to be like, hey, call my guy. He's not going to do you wrong. If you say it's me, like he'll give you a good price and he'll get the project done right. Like those are kind of invaluable things that also help de-risk you a little bit, right? And not to say anything about trades, but there's always risk in the trades, right? Like if you get a bad one, it could put your deal completely sideways, right? So having somebody that has a good reputation, is good with that.
Okay, so I know you're about to launch a podcast. What is it called?
Door stories. So instead of the war stories, even though in real estate they're all seems like war stories, right? So everybody talks about how many doors they have, right? So we landed on door stories. Yeah, it's the Door Stories podcast.
Okay, so when that is launched, the audience can come to your podcast and listen and learn more about you. But meanwhile, how does the audience get in touch with you?
Yeah, so I'm on LinkedIn, but I would encourage people, even though there's a lot of controversy with Twitter right now, but like I would encourage people to get on Twitter, and my handle is at Apurva, APURVA 212. It's just at Apurva 212. But I would encourage you to get on Twitter because there's an entire community of real estate investors on Twitter, and it's very active and it's very thriving. And the way to follow it, if you're on Twitter, if you don't know how to use Twitter, go YouTube that. I can't help you. But once you learn how to use Twitter, the hashtag is #RETWIT, RETWIT. And if you start just following that stream, you'll be immersed with the real estate community. And I think people that aren't on it are missing out because there's just tons of great activity and action there. And that's honestly where I've learned about self-storage, was just following people that were actively operators, and I just learned what they were doing, and then I just followed their playbooks.
Here is my biggest takeaway from Apurva. Always do the math and seize the right investment opportunities regardless of the asset class. And hey, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell to stay up to date with more amazing stories and insights from our real estate ballers. Thanks for joining us today. Keep hustling, and I can't wait to see you in the next video.